We are going to be doing an interview with a lovely Stormgate dev. For those of you, if you haven't watched any of our interviews, please go check out the interview with Tim Morton that we did recently on my channel, where we did a big kind of top-down view of what the heck Stormgate is, the new RTS from Frost Giant, what's actually going on there. And now we're going to be getting into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty, because I have joining me Solid Monk, Kevin Dong, a beautiful developer. What is your role over at Stormgate, mate?
Yeah, at Frost Giant, I'm working on Stormgate as the lead co-op designer, and right now I am focusing a lot on the gameplay of the game, the moment-to-moment gameplay. So I'm working on a lot of things like what do our units do, and what are like the core mechanics of the game, and it's just really exciting time here at Frost Giant.
Heck yeah. Obviously, you're very busy right now talking about the game. You guys have been working in the back scenes behind this for about 2 years now, right? And is that how long? Because I remember you were one of the first people to join Frost Giant. So is it about 2 years now that you guys have been kind of planning and getting everything together? And recently, the team has started to kind of expand and grow. And I hear that development is really picking up, right?
Yeah, it's been almost 2 years. I think I started around September, and a lot of that was through COVID. So a lot of things have changed ever since we started the company. And as you can see, actually, you probably can't see because there's a green screen behind me. But I'm can't. It's so exciting to be like working in an office with so many other passionate RTS developers around me. It's just really awesome.
Yeah, it's been really nice to see. I mean, a few things got put out on like the Frost Giant channel of The Office. I do remember talking to you guys a little bit when you were still all remote, and it's nice to see you all in one space, kind of getting the creative juices flowing and that sort of stuff. So I think what's been interesting has been a lot of people saying, hey, the announcement for Frost Giant's RTS Stormgate didn't have that many details in it, because they were kind of like, hey, here's 2 minutes on a stage showing a trailer and then talking about it. But a lot more information is getting talked about in interviews. I've watched a few of yours and a few of the other team members. So we have a lot of different things that I know this audience wants us to get into. So let's start talking about it. On the more casual side, first of all, people keep on asking about the factions. Two have been announced. So there's the Infernal Host, the Demon Invaders, the Human Resistance that has not really been named yet. And we've heard at least another faction. Is there anything more you can share about that?
I don't know if you asked this to Tim Morton, but what I can share is just that yes, there is going to be two factions released so far, and we will release either faction, more additional faction, or factions in the future. That's all I can
Awesome.
say right now.
Okay, thought so. I had to ask that because I did forget to ask Tim of that the other day, so you got
Got
thrown in
it.
the spotlight there.
Yeah, but if I can provide some more context about the factions right now and the
Yeah.
backstory behind those factions, which I'm not sure if you've heard of, basically the setting is kind of a near future Earth, where Earth has gone through sort of an apocalypse, but it's not like a very dreary apocalypse. The humans have gone through this devastating event. We don't know what it is yet. Well, I do, but the audience doesn't, and they're kind of turning into a more hopeful civilization. Things are on the up and up, and everything's kind of working out. However, the Stormgate appears, and the demons are coming. Or these demonic light creatures are coming from these Stormgates and invading. So it's as we follow the campaign, we get to discover who these demons are, where they come from, what they're all about, and hopefully discover a little bit about the apocalypse that happened many years ago as well.
Awesome. I'm very keen to hear more about this world, because obviously I've heard a lot about your goals developing an RTS over the last couple of years, but to finally get a glimpse into the world and have something concrete to latch onto, finally we can stop guessing. Is it, oh, we got fantasy, sci-fi, what's going to be going on? What is the lore? So I'm very curious to see, and I'll be hanging on every word when new announcements do come out on that. Of course, for now, getting straight on into the actual kind of gameplay, we've seen, obviously, you guys have announced that you've got four main pillars of play. Competitive, we've got, the 3v3 social competitive mode, as well as the 1v1 competitive mode. got the co-op. Of course, you're a huge part of that, as well as the campaign, single player, and kind of story mode, which is already planned. We heard from Tim many years out ahead of time, and there's basically story beats to kind of develop new campaigns and continue it, and no aim to just kind of go, hey, here's one campaign, close off the storyline, cut everything off, and that'll be it, and it's never releasing anything else. But I think focusing outside of that on the competitive and the co-op side, a lot of people have been really excited to hear about all of that. So for you, I'm curious, with your background in StarCraft, Warcraft, and other RTS games, what do you think's most important in terms of the keeping people online, enjoying the game, having kind of social experiences and stuff? And what do you think about, I guess, the comparison between StarCraft 2, a game which we're constantly comparing to because it is kind of the leading RTS, and its team games setup compared to the team game setup that you guys are looking to in Frost Giant?
Yeah, so often when we were on the StarCraft team, we kind of realized that even though StarCraft you could play with friends, and there was a chat system, that it can be a very lonely experience. It can be a very solitary experience. And we feel that a lesson that we learned, especially after we released the co-op mode of StarCraft, the PvE mode, back in 2015, which was a surprise runaway hit, is that part of the success of a lot of modern games these days is the variety of it being a social game. This has worked for a lot of games such as like FPS, MOBAs, Battle Royales, Roblox. Among Us and Fall Guys are examples of two games that have been really successful over the pandemic, for instance. And with a social game, we hope to be a better, not only better, but less intimidating experience for new players. And we hope it's an experience that allows you to bring your friends into the game in order to experience the game as a team. Either in the campaign, either in the co-op, or the competitive, perhaps in the 3v3 team battle game mode. And for every single game mode that we have, we are designing it ground up to be a better experience for you and your friends to come together and have that team experience.
This is something where people, I think, mistakenly have said a lot, hey, when is RTS going to return to the glory days? It used to be all of the top AAA RTS games being developed were RTSs. There was Command and Conquers and StarCrafts and Dark Reigns and all these Age of Mythologies and Age of Empires, so many games, and we want to return to that. How do we get RTS back there? But I always think back to, as a young lad who grew up with RTS games from Command and Conquer and Warcraft 1 and 2 and all this sort of stuff, and I always got to see very firsthand, physically, socially, that the old RTS games weren't social. And this is, people like return to the glory days of Brood War, Warcraft 3. And I spent a lot of my formative years in the early 2000s in a local internet cafe, PC bang, whatever you want to call it. And I'll tell you what, it was really hard to find someone to play 1v1 StarCraft or Warcraft 3 with, dude. It was really hard. But dude, when Dota came out, everyone was playing Dota. With Counter-Strike, everyone was getting into play Counter-Strike, and half the people didn't know how to play these games. I mean, there was always the person feeding in the Dota games, running in and getting themselves killed. There's always the people who couldn't figure out how to, they'd be running around with one bullet in their MP5 and then, shoot the one bullet and be like, oh, what? I haven't reloaded. Ooh. No one knew what they were doing. But there'd be one or two people who would actually be willing to play kind of 1v1 Warcraft 3 with you or 1v1 StarCraft with you. And even then it was on one of those unlimited resource maps usually or something like that. So people are kind of often saying, hey, we need to return to the glory days of RTS. And I think what people often miss is those glory days, whilst they did have some good chat channels in them and some social things that were pretty cute, loved the clans in Warcraft 3, they were lacking a lot as well compared to these other games that had more naturally cooperative modes, right? Team modes, getting your friends in. They were more accessible in many ways. So I think this is something where this is actually, you guys do need to beat kind of a new path with this, right? And immediately open up these almost as the main way of playing so that people realize what's going on. Because For me, it's like you want to create that same feeling of like, for me, I remember being so excited when Dota came out and I didn't know what Dota was because I was like, everyone's playing Warcraft 3. I'm finally going to have heaps of people to play Warcraft 3. And nobody was playing Warcraft 3. They were all playing Dota, and I was very sad. But
Huh.
yeah, it's kind of a new path that you guys have to beat to create a truly social RTS. I don't think there's been one before.
I think you cut out at the end, but yeah, I would say so. Like you bring up a lot of good points with a lot of the older RTSs. My experience, and I think a lot of my friends' experiences with StarCraft One was that we didn't play hardcore 1v1 at the time. We really, throughout my course with StarCraft One, I really enjoyed the esports. But as a individual, I mostly played maps like 2v2v2. BGH, for example. And from Warcraft 3, I did play a bunch of competitive 1v1 Warcraft 3, but at the same time, most of my time was spent in the custom games or the arcade of Warcraft 3 format, where maybe I wasn't playing Dota, but I was playing a lot of other MOBAs at the time. I was playing like Footman Frenzy,
Oh
Castle
yeah.
Fight. Yeah, and these are all games where you engage with a team and you engage with you have the capability to engage with a lot of friends. I think that's something that StarCraft 2 didn't have as much with. It was really built with 1v1 especially in mind. And for example, like it did not have the as robust UGC lobbies where you were able to find the interesting UGC games, and it didn't have as robust chat channels, especially at launch, to facilitate that social experience. So overall, not only I talked a lot about how we're trying to make Stormgate a more social RTS in terms of our individual game modes, but something else is the out of game experience that we're focusing on as well. The ability for you to find these friends, whether that is in terms of in channels or in terms of in custom game lobbies as well.
Heck yeah. So trying to get that's going to be really interesting, and seeing if it's something where just having people be more social within the game, and have that as a natural thing is going to be great. I do still remember that, logging into StarCraft 2 for the first time, and there was like no chat channels, and you just got your 1v1 rank in front of your face, and it's like, hey, that's what the game is, I guess, because it's like, it's just this rank and this fine game match. And I mean, I just think about every game I've ever enjoyed the most. It always involves me, especially if it's a bit more hardcore. Even single player games like XCOM, there's a lot of like going out in the forums and discussing how to like solve certain problems within the game, or how to beat an Elden Ring boss or a Dark Souls boss, and figuring out little techniques. And when you're in a community, it's just more natural to learn. And I guess that's kind of what happened with co-op, right? Tim was saying in our interview, like, oh, we didn't have an onboarding system and people just taught their friends how to do it and it blew up. And we were like, oh, we didn't expect that to happen. But it turns out your friends are often the best teachers and onboarders of the game. So if you guys can play together, then it's naturally there's going to be this spread of information. That's where virality starts. It's my friends who are messaging me to play team games, or to go drink a virtual beer and dig some rocks in Deep Rock Galactic, or whatever other
Yeah.
silly accessible social mode is available, in a new game. So moving on beyond that, though, I think that's a great focus. Let's talk just briefly about Snowplay. So you guys have a really big focus from day one, before Snowplay was even on your tongues, about the engine's ability to make the gameplay crisp and responsive. I remember, we've talked in the past about like turn rate on units, and responsiveness and all this sorts of stuff within how it's coded. But even underneath that, from the very base level, the engine needs to support it. And this is something we've seen a lot of RTS games struggle with. They feel clunky, the units are slow to respond. So I guess for the layman watching, why is it that RTS feels so clunky, and like how does Snowplay address that, just on a very basic level?
Yeah, I think the reason that some players might perceive some RTSs to be clunky these days is that, um, especially in the communities that we're in, we're really ingrained with the idea that StarCraft 2 is the kind of the gold standard. StarCraft 2 kind of set us like an insanely high bar for the responsiveness, for units like kind of intuiting what you want them to do, not only like responding to the commands, but also intuiting like the desire of the player. And that's not only through the engine itself, but through a lot of UI UX considerations. that don't exist in a lot of other games. In my mind, if Stormgate is to be successful, um, uh, I think like almost 50% of what we do has to do with making sure we get the responsiveness, making sure we get the pathfinding correct, so that it is at least comparable to that of StarCraft 2. And in order to do so, we've developed what we like to call, and as you mentioned, Snowplay. Snowplay is developed by
Sorry, could I interrupt
lead.
for just one moment? Can you just move the
Sure,
mic just slightly further away from your mouth? It's just starting to clip a little bit.
got it.
I
Is that a
think
little better?
that's perfect. Thank you.
Awesome.
Sorry.
So, what is Snowplay? Okay, so Snowplay is it's a completely custom built and it's highly configurable, extremely efficient gameplay simulation. And it unlocks very low bandwidth multiplayer game features. So essentially, what that means is it's almost like an engine that is built on top of Unreal 5 that we're going to use for our gameplay simulation and to control the gameplay. It's headed by the ex-lead pathfinding engineer of StarCraft 2, James Anhalt, who has a lot of great like GDC talks on how he did what he did on StarCraft 2, and that's going to give us personally a lot of confidence on trying getting to unlock the responsiveness and the pathfinding that was in StarCraft 2. And again, in my mind, this is like almost 50% of our success. I think if we are to be successful, we have to at least match what we had in StarCraft.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, it's really complicated as well and stuff. But what I hear there is that James is basically the best dark wizard at understanding this complex kind of system and hopefully building that beautiful dark magic into the game to make it feel crisp and responsive. And I think it's so important for the micro and the interaction focus, which is kind of the direction that RTS does seem to be going more. In general, it does feel like there will be an inevitable move in most RTS games to a little bit more focus on the wrestling with your opponent and the interaction rather than wrestling with the mechanics of the game. We've seen that happen, I think, steadily, basically through all RTSs, where it becomes easier to multi-building select, for instance, in StarCraft 2 compared to StarCraft 1, allowing you to kind of focus a little bit more on the interaction with the opponent. Do you think this is going to be a natural progression for Stormgate as well, or is there anything you're doing to kind of try and, I don't know, like we still want to preserve there is still skill with like base building and macro, right? In this game, is that still something you guys are trying to preserve?
Yeah. So our goal with Stormgate is to lower the barrier to entry, lower the skill floor, while at the same time maintaining the skill ceiling that has traditionally existed in a lot of Blizzard RTSs, and in some ways increasing the skill ceiling. For example, you brought up base building. So that's one of the things that we hope to reinforce the idea of in StarCraft or in Stormgate over previous Blizzard RTSs. We want the idea of base building to be more impactful and to have more decision making behind where you place your buildings. Far as wrestling with the game goes, our lead UX designer Ryan Shooter can probably talk about this a little better, but I'm going to do my best. We plan to have various approachability features that allow newer players to get into the game more easily. For example, something that we want to try out is automated control groups. And this is basically the idea that if you build a marine, let's say, you have the option. This is an opt-in feature to automatically put that marine in control group 1. And if you build a siege tank, it'll automatically put it in control group 2. I want to say that this is not necessarily the best thing to do, right? As a pro player, you might not necessarily want that. For example, innovation, he often rallies all his stuff to a supply depot, and he reinforces his pushes via a group of units rather than a singular unit because it is less likely to be picked off by a bunch of, like, let's say, Zerglings, for instance. But for a newer player, this can be such a great help. Not only because you're allowed to control units that you've made instantly, but also it allows us an avenue for tutorialization. In a tutorial, we could say select hotkey 1 or just press 1, and that gets you all your infantry units. Press hotkey 3, and that gets you all your air units. So that opens a lot of approachability there. Second, we're going to have something we like to call merge command cards. So that's the idea of in StarCraft 1, or StarCraft, you often have the situation where you have to stim, and then you have to tab, and then you have to use a seeker missile or an interference
Tab
matrix, for
over to like
instance.
the widow mine to borrow it, and you're say you've got 5 units, you don't know what you're tabbing to. It gets very confusing.
Yeah. I feel like this is especially problematic, and I think especially problematic with, let's say, the Terran and Protoss factions. The Terrans, for instance, oftentimes, even at the pro level play, Terran players cannot handle both tanks and liberators and widow mines. You just have to tab so many times and siege all the units individually. For Protoss have so many abilities that this also becomes very cumbersome. So our idea with the merge command card system is to allow players to access a lot of their abilities from a single command card, so that tabbing is less of a thing in Stormgate.
That's
And then,
awesome. Yeah, I think that's really going to help out a lot with the overload, right? We've all seen a top Terran like Maru just grab his Raven and just throw it away to harass, and you're like, wouldn't that be good in the army? And he's like, yeah, but even he knows he's going to just get it killed, or it's going to make him fumble his other abilities, right? And if the best Terran in the world's doing that, what hope do the other players have? It's kind of funny because you'll see lower level players not know to do that. So they'll have the 6 different spellcasters in the one army and not be able to use any abilities, whereas the pro will actually throw away a few of those that are less important because even the
yeah.
best players are better at realizing they can't control all of that. So that's going to be cool, merging all of that. Is there any way you preserve the hotkeys? Like you're going to try and make it so it's not they're not like changing like, oh, Storm is sometimes this button and then it changes what that button is. If we've got a few other units selected, you're going to try and have some like exclusivity rules or something, right?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be a lot of rules around this. And again, probably Ryan can talk about this a little better. But I believe that the buttons will maintain the positions that they generally are in. So you won't have situations where if you have like X and Y units, Storm will be on hotkey Q, but if you have Y and Z units, Storm will be on hotkey W, for instance.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's fascinating. So I guess obviously we don't want to go too deep into that. Anyone watching, go check out Harsim's video with Ryan Shooter, which is really fascinating over on his YouTube. So and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to him at some point down the track because yeah, it's so funny when we talk about this, like, hey, how can we make this more accessible and stuff? And it sometimes sounds like, hey, are we just going to make the game play itself? But I do like this philosophy of there's all these little ways you can make things easier, but it won't necessarily be the best way to do it, right? So you can turn on all these auto systems or use all these things like, oh, just every unit gets thrown that's a tank gets thrown into this control group. But obviously, then how are you going to control tanks in 3 different places? Well, there's a differentiation, but the base level of trying to grab your stuff and do things is going to feel smooth. So I believe it was you I heard talking about like a few of the other features for this other than that. So there'll be like a global command queue that like you can just basically build a building and it'll automatically find a worker to build it as well. But that's going to be kind of inefficient, right? Because like a pro player would always pull the worker before they have the resources so they can start it like instantly when they have the 400 minerals for a command center, right?
Yeah, exactly. We like to call that the quick macro panel, and
Quick
that's a way
macro.
that
Okay.
yeah, quick macro. So not only are you going to be able to build buildings, you're also going to be able to build units and research upgrades via that panel as well. You pointed out a potential inefficiency with the quick macro panel, which is exactly what we want to go for. Newer players will be able to still macro buildings, macro units, macro upgrades more easily, but more experienced players will be able to get a little more out of the system by micromanaging individual units. Another example when it comes to building units, for example, is let's say I have 2 barracks. One is a proxy barracks closer to the front of the battle, and another is a barracks in your base. Maybe you want to reinforce your fight a little faster, and you can only afford one Marine. By using the quick macro panel in order to build a Marine, the Marine might build from your main base, when in
Mm.
reality, a more experienced, a pro player might individually select the barracks he wants to build from and build the Marine from that barracks. So a lot of ways for pro players to differentiate their skill, even in with the existence of a quick macro panel.
That's going to be so fascinating just to see like what gets used the most by pro gamers and in what situations, right? Because like, it'll be funny. There'll be like a world champion level player, but like, oh no, they always micro their macro. They never use the panel, and you're like, oh no, in this situation they do, right? So, as always, there's going to be choices to do with your attention and how spread you are in terms of that attention in the game, and how much you use the less efficient technique versus really micromanaging each thing. And so for me, this makes me so happy hearing this because for me, RTS games are so enjoyable because of the choice. A lot of people go, "Oh, it's overwhelming in RTS games. Sometimes there's so much going on." For me, that's always been the joy of it. Is that like someone can be a better macro player than me, especially or micro player, sorry, especially living in Australia. I'm usually playing with a 200 ping handicap. It's not fun to be in a roach versus roach pure mechanical micro war, dodging corrosive biles and managing concaves. It's not fun because I can feel that handicap, whether that's a skill one or an imposed one by the lag. But the more I have the option to focus on switching into a different tech or focusing more on my macro or a different area of the game, doing backstabs, right? Multi-prong attacks. There's this vast amount of choice in terms of how you manage your economy, what army you go for. There's so many kind of different possible solutions in a StarCraft game and most RTS games. And I think a lot of people are afraid that those choices can get kind of edited out of the game as you make things more accessible. But this philosophy feels like if you hold true to it, it should avoid that problem because you've still got the exact same decisions going on. You've just got, oh, you can do some easier ways, but you can always still micromanage and make those different strategic choices in terms of how you approach the problems, right? So you guys are trying to maintain the complexity. It's just you don't have to go as complicated, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's really our driving philosophy around all the UX UI features that we plan to implement into the game. Something else you brought up is like the question of will pro players engage with this? And my answer with this is I actually don't really know because if you ask me prior to the release of Heart of the Swarm, hey, we're gonna add an F2 button that like selects your entire army. Will pro players engage with it? I would have said maybe not because like yeah they're pro players, they're very practiced, they're gonna know exactly what to move and what parts of their army to move at all times. But in reality, you see a lot of F2s, a lot of like six observers kind of converging, trying to form a mega observer in the middle of the map. That happens.
Everyone has their own way of playing the game. The best Protoss player in the world, Hero, right now, just famously doesn't use control groups like a normal human. He F2s everything, and he only uses his two army groups for the two most recent things that he's been controlling so that he can double tap to jump back to them. So you watch his control groups, and it's just changing every 3 seconds in the game. And you're like, I've never seen someone use a control group like that in an RTS, but hey, you're the best Protoss in the world. I'll allow it. And that F2 button is just flashing like a light when you watch a replay of his. It's just going the whole time. Yeah, I think it's going to get used a lot more than a lot of casual people might realize. They might, oh, Cyril will never use this. He's a macro god, guys. Trust me, Cyril's going to use the crap out of these features. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how players will use it though, and when they'll prioritize it. So I actually think that's fascinating. Are there any other features in the UX we want to touch on that you'd like to include before we move on?
I guess the only other main one is we're going to be switching to a grid system as our default. It's kind of gaming has moved towards that system,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't necessarily want players to memorize hotkeys for individual abilities as much, especially when we think more globally. These, like for example, stim is hotkey T, but if you translate stim to other languages, there's not always going to be an obvious like T that fits into every language that you can slot it into. So more of a grid-based system that allows a grid-based hotkey system that allows us to be more transferable between the different locales and allows the game to be more approachable so that you don't have to learn individual uh, hotkeys for individual abilities.
And will those be customizable?
So right now, that's a great point. Right now, our current plan is that the individual buttons will be customizable, but not necessarily the individual abilities. And this is something that we're looking for a lot of feedback on. How important is it for an RTS player to be able to customize those abilities? So let's say you have Storm and Force Field both on Hotkey Q, for instance. Is it important that yes, you will be able to shift that hotkey to, let's say, hotkey T, but is it important to differentiate the idea that I need to be able to use force field and psionic storm on different hotkeys? Um, so in order to get us from where we are now, where it's more of a button-based remapping of hotkeys to an ability-based mapping of hotkeys is actually a ton of work. So uh, as a company, we have to kind of determine what our priorities are, and this is one thing we're asking community: what should we prioritize in this case?
So sorry, you guys are saying you're currently focused on you can remap the button, not the ability, right?
Yes.
Okay. So obviously that means you can change Q, so all the Q abilities are on T. But
Yes.
you couldn't say individually do Storm and to T, Force Field to Y, whatever other weirdness. Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
this is yeah.
I also want to caveat that with the storm and force field example is probably not the best one because these are both kind of seen as the primary abilities. And how it would work in our game is that we would actually probably shift the primary abilities onto different buttons. So, for example, we wouldn't have storm and because storm and force field are primary abilities, we wouldn't have them on the same button necessarily.
Yeah.
But rather, you would be able to use Q for storm and W for force field, for example.
That on a design level comes to how well you guys do design the choice of those hotkeys, and of course this comes down to the merged command card, right, where if you do have the sentries and the high templar and the disruptors all on one key, they will naturally have those different keys already, right, for a common composition, say. I've played a lot of different RTSs that have experimented with different features over the last few years like this, and I do find, as someone who uses one of the most advanced customized hotkey setups called the core in StarCraft 2. I use the right side of the keyboard on a slant. Everyone thinks I'm left-handed. They're like, what are you doing? Like, what is going on? Why are your keys over there? I actually find if a game does this well, just from my own personal experiences, this is more for the people listening, I don't mind. Every other game I do play with a standard hotkey setup, and the better these sort of command cards can be merged, the better that sort of thing. I do find it's completely fine for me. But in a game like StarCraft 2, where you don't have merged command cards, you have such fast paced battles and you don't have any of these nice UX features like that. I definitely feel the need to like fully customize everything. So for me, if you don't end up having the fully customizable abilities as well as keys, I think for me, I think that rests on how well you guys do the merged command cards, and I absolutely think that can work. I know there will be some players who rebel at that and go, no, 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 we need the fully customizable keys, and that would be a nice thing to have. But I'm definitely hopeful that I would be able to play with the completely standard hotkeys that you guys introduce, and I think that is how I would actually approach the game personally. So interesting to see how that works out, but thanks for the insight on that.
Hmm.
So someone in Twitch chat actually asked a question. They said, I've heard that Frost Giant are going to use machine learning for tutorial prompts to help new players improve on things that they're weak at, maybe after the game, telling you, hey, you could have built more units, or, oh, if you took your expansion quicker, then you could have kept up in economy. Is that true?
We are actually definitely explicitly not using machine learning for these purposes. Machine learning probably requires a number of resources that we probably do not have right now. But what we are planning on doing is, especially for newer players, we will have something. We're looking into something what we call reactive tutorials, which is the idea that, for example, in our prototype, we had something where if we noticed that your camera was not shifting, we would say, "Hey, did you know you can pan the camera to the right or pan the camera to the left in order to get more to get vision of more of the map?" So that is a very simplistic example, but that's an example of something that we're looking at that doesn't involve the complexities of machine learning.
Cool. I think definitely working on the tutorial system and stuff like that is great. Interesting though, a lot of people do get excited by the idea of the AI being involved in there in the machine learning. Uh, okay, just for special, we'll ask a very stupid question here, which we may or may not edit out of the interview. Will there be battery overcharge in Stormgate? Says special.
I can't guarantee that there will or will not be, but if there is battery overcharge, I'll tell you in advance, and you can pick that faction.
Okay, good job. We've got Juanito covered there. No worries. He says sick, so he's very happy about that. Okay, so how many units will we be able to control? Is there going to be any limits on how many units you control or a supply cap?
In terms of the ability to control units, realistically, there won't be a limit similar to StarCraft 2, even though there technically was a limit in StarCraft 2, but probably won't be able to reach that in a standard game of Stormgate. In terms of the supply gap, what we're aiming for right now is 200 supply cap, with the caveat that for some of the factions, we're looking to exceed the numbers you typically have with a Zerg army, and some of the other factions we are looking to have fewer numbers than that of the Protoss. So a greater disparity in terms of number of units on the battlefield.
Okay, cool. Is there a plan to follow the StarCraft 2 design philosophy of trying to make it so the tier 1 units are still relevant into the late game?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is a problem that Warcraft 3 falls into, where kind of you never want to make the grunt if you have access to the Tauren, right? But generally, I think StarCraft does a good job of kind of allowing the early game units to come back into the game in the late game, either via their innate mobility or some kind of late game mechanic. So that's something we definitely want to replicate. And there's two strategies, or one strategy for how we intend to do this relative to StarCraft 2, which is we want to very closely limit the number of units on each faction for a variety of reasons. But with regards to specifically this functionality, you in StarCraft 2, you end up with situations where there are, let's say, like 3 or 4 early game units, but it's really hard to bring them all back into the late game. I think the best examples are like the Reaper, the Adept, and the Roach.
Yeah.
And just as a funny anecdote, if because I had worked on StarCraft, one thing that we were thinking about on the StarCraft team, if we stayed on the StarCraft team for a year or so longer, is we wanted to give Reapers a late game upgrade that was on the tech lab for the barracks, but required the fusion core, and it greatly increased the damage of Reapers to buildings. So this would be a way for, like, these Reapers are able to subvert terrain, and it would allow for an alternate to the Marine drops in terms of harassment against opponents.
Cool.
And you might be crazy, but you theoretically could like open like 5 racks Reaper and then transition to Fusion Core and get this upgrade and just play the whole game with Reapers, for instance.
Euthermal somewhere licking his lips at that idea, I'm sure. 2016 Beyond as well.
Yeah.
Some cool ideas to bring it back. The old satchel charges, but that's actually really cool. I do like that philosophy because yeah, there are a few other RTSs I've played recently as well where you get past this point and you're just massing up like these big tanks or capital ships or something like that, and it does become a bit of two big blobs. But having these mobile units in StarCraft 2 for run bys often in the late game and stuff like that definitely keeps it usable. So there's some interesting ways that can still come into play. So game length, I believe you guys have said you're aiming for about a 20-minute game length. Is that right?
Yeah, so with respect to game length, the answer to this question is actually slightly different when it comes to 1v1 and the 3v3 team battle mode. For 3v3 team battle, we are aiming for that 20-minute game length. Um, and specifically, we're aiming for much more predictable game lengths. So even though it's a 20-minute average game length, we imagine 90% of the games will last between 15 minutes and let's say 30 minutes, right? Even though the average, the mean will be 20 minutes, the range will be not so wide. Whereas in the 1v1 mode, we imagine that the average game length will be closer to that of the Blizzard RTSs, which is kind of in the high teens. Um,
Yeah.
and the stipulation there is that there will be more variability in terms of how long games last. Um, and another caveat there is um, we want to especially limit the number of games that end very, very early, like in the first 2 minutes of the game, for example. And how we intend to do that is to give players some kind of innate based defender's advantage. So a great example of that
Ding,
is
ding,
the
ding. Town bell.
Town Bell. Yeah, Town Bell is a great example. I was going to say the Burrow, which is kind of very similar.
Yeah.
The Burrow is like it doesn't prevent you from like it doesn't. You can still do a lot of damage against an orc player in Warcraft 3 if they have a Burrow up, but it prevents and mitigates game-ending damage. So we still definitely want the ability for you to attack your opponent and harass your opponent in the early game, but we don't want the situation of like a proxy 2-Rax, for example, that can instantly end the game. Um, I will also say that I think in terms of innate base defenses, there are there's definitely a spectrum there. And I think in Warcraft 3, it's the lightest touch that you can have with it still being base defense. Whereas if you move on to the other end of the spectrum where you have Company of Heroes bases are basically unassailable in the early game.
Yeah.
And specifically for the 1v1 mode, that's not something we're looking to happen.
Yeah, that's it's interesting. It's so funny, right? Yeah, because I wasn't thinking of Company of Heroes, right? I was thinking of Age of Empires at first, where there's kind of a avoid the town center for the whole early game and go
Yeah,
around and try to deny a resource and force them to move their workers to another area, which is just a big disruption. And then Company of Heroes is just no, you can capture a few more points on the map, but otherwise
yeah,
there is no way you're getting in there. And then there's the StarCraft 2 end of the spectrum, which is for the RTS fans who aren't StarCraft fans, one of the most hated things. You know, it's really funny if you're in an Age of Empires chat or something, and there's an ex StarCraft player like a Marine Lord playing, and there's people going, "No, he's just gonna rush in the first 2 minutes because that's all StarCraft is. You just attack. They never know. They never expand. StarCraft's about attacking, and it's just like there's this kind of conception." Because the games can be so brutal and sudden that everyone is just cheesing each other and charging in, and it doesn't give you as much of a chance to kind of digest your loss. It feels a little bit more unfair to most players. And
yeah,
it's funny because I noticed this as a really experienced RTS player who's going to naturally be a little bit more understanding of why I lose and salty. But when I was getting into Age of Empires 2 last year and playing through that for the first time competitively, and I was like, oh, I'm getting hammered by someone and totally outplayed, but like somehow just being able to put my guys in the town center and move them around, like I have more time to digest the fact that I'm getting outplayed as opposed to those 12 Marines going in, gunning down my drone pool, and I'm just like, oh, this didn't feel fair at all. And it's kind of funny because there's really no logical difference. It's just the feeling of it. And that's a big part of what you guys are looking for in game design, right? It's how people feel about the experience of playing the game. And that's something which you've got to really tap into.
yeah. I think a lot of game design is about having empathy for the player and understanding like why they're feeling the way they're feeling. I think another great point that you brought up is that um, a lot of things in game design and in RTS design in particular, they end up on a spectrum. I think players have can tend to have strong reactions to this is like not exactly how StarCraft did it, or you're going to add like innate base defenses and that's going to kill early game aggression. Whereas you pointed out, it's actually a spectrum of StarCraft is kind of the RTS game that has the least innate base defenses, and then it goes somewhere along the lines of Warcraft 3, and then Age of Empires, and then Company of Heroes. So different games approach it in different ways, and we're kind of just trying to move on the spectrum instead of it being like kind of a binary choice where you can't assault the enemy base at all.
Heck yeah, mate. It's that extreme freedom of choice is also where some extreme pain comes from in StarCraft. So I like that you guys are trying to preserve some of that while easing the problem points just a little bit. So, resources. Have you guys able to share anything about the resources in Stormgate yet? Will it be two, three, four workers mining? Anything?
Yeah, I have so much to talk about with regards to resources. Uh, RTS economy design, I think, is maybe my favorite topic in all of RTS design overall. So I can share what we have right now, and what we have is something fairly close to. It's going to be a two resource system, similar to that of StarCraft, where you have a core resource and then you have a tech resource that is rate limited, like Vespian gas. We like the idea that Vespian gas allows you to scout your opponent, and you can say, "Hey, I see as Colossus at the 5 minute mark, and as a pro player, I know because I see all this gas invested into the Colossus, and I know he has exactly two gas. I know that he can't also have a Stargate and a Void Ray at the same time. I know he can't also be researching Blink. I know he can't also have
Hmm.
Double Forge. So that kind of nuance we think is really cool with respect to gas. With respect to the primary resource, our mineral equivalent, we're taking inspirations from a variety of games. The first being StarCraft One, where there's diminishing returns for each subsequent worker you build. The first worker you build might have 100% efficiency for mining, and the second might have 95%, and the third worker might have 90%. Of course, made up numbers. But the
Yeah.
point is, every subsequent worker has diminishing returns, and we feel like this has two positive outcomes. The first is it encourages players to expand. One of the absolute core tenets, even I would argue the number one gameplay tenet of Stormgate is that we really want to be focused on the importance of territory control and the importance of expanding territory to gain bonuses like resources and contrasting that with opening yourself to more avenues of attack and opening yourself to more risk. So with the diminishing return of resources, if you have two bases with 10 workers, you're going to be mining at a higher rate than if you have one base of 10 with 10 workers. Um, and this is in contrast to StarCraft 2, if you have 10 workers on two bases, it's the same exact amount of income as two bases as one base with 10 workers. Another thing this gets us is it helps to diminish the impact of worker harassment.
Hmm.
If you have 10 workers in StarCraft 2 and you lose half of them, you lose 50% of your income. Whereas in Stormgate or like in StarCraft 1, you might lose 50% of your workers, but in reality, because of the diminishing returns, you lose 30% of your income there. Um,
Yeah, and
so
I think a lot of people might not be as familiar with how different that is between StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2. I think from the sounds of this, you're a big proponent of the double harvesting debate that went on for several years in the StarCraft 2 community, where we were talking about how because it was that flat mining rate, right, up to 16 workers a base, it was kind of this linear thing where you kill those workers, it's this flat damage, right? But if you can allow people to have a very clear risk reward between you take four bases and bam, you spread those workers out and you've got this great advantage, but you're so much more open to harass and attack, and you've got to control so much territory to protect that economy. My next question was going to be about map controls. We're already talking about that, right? That is going to be a fundamental part. You said zone control and being able to cover those bases and that sort of stuff. So trying to get a little bit more towards that, hey, map control is vital and an integral part of it. And for me, I always think of this in an almost romantic sense because my introduction to esports was watching English dubbed best Korean Golden Mouse Brood War matches ever, and you're watching this wrestling match for the mini map with the way Brood War worked with unit control and that sort of stuff. So it's going to be hard though to create that. Obviously, you say, hey, more bases, you get more payoff even with the same amount of workers by spreading them. That could be awesome. But at the same time, with modern pathing systems, there can be issues with like, couldn't the fights just be a bit too decisive? Are there other ways like ramps, high ground advantages, diminishing air units, things like that to make it so that the map control is a big part, but it's not going to like suddenly be one side just dominates the map and just kills the other guy?
you brought up so many points to talk about there. I'm going to do my best to address all of them.
It's all right. I'll remind you of anything we missed. We'll circle back if we need.
Awesome, awesome. So I talked about territory control being one of the core gameplay tenets of Stormgate. I would say if that is like the number one gameplay tenet, number two and three are the ideas of the importance of terrain and the reinforcement of defender's advantage. And what that means is um, overall, we want terrain to matter more. We don't want situations where you are able to subvert the terrain via let's say like Reaper jumps, or in StarCraft 2, I feel like a lot of the transports are subvert the terrain in uh, too easy a manner. So just as an
Yeah.
example, I think the medevacs, for example, they come on very early on into the game, and they are completely able to allow any ground unit to subvert terrain. And in contrast to StarCraft 1, where the medevac was actually, or the dropship was very difficult to get in terms of where it was on the tech tree, you're less encouraged to tech to a starport in StarCraft 1. But also, there is a very low opportunity cost for getting a medevac. Even if you didn't want the drop potential of the medevac, you would still get it because you want it to heal, right? So this
Yeah.
is, if you're just getting it to heal, it's kind of just a bonus that you just have a dropship that is super fast and allows you to subvert that terrain. And with the importance of terrain and with the importance of defender's advantage, I think we can get cool moments like in StarCraft 1 where you have these moments where like these two lurkers are defending against 100 Marines, right? And it allows for really interesting army shapes. It allows for really interesting base shapes where Zerg is expanding, not like right next to themselves, but expanding all over the map in corners of different bases. And we think that that's really cool. Um, Another thing we talked about is air units, and this kind of
Yeah.
relates to the importance of terrain, right? We think that at Frost Giant, we really think that ground versus ground battles are really cool, right? Both factions or both the opponents are kind of maneuvering around the terrain in order to jostle for the position. And this also ties into the importance of territory control, which is our core gameplay tenet. So these some units might have the ability to traverse different types of terrain, but at the very least, they're very limited by terrain overall. We
Hmm.
also think that ground versus air battles are really cool because you often have this very strong ground force versus a much more mobile air force. However, I think the least interesting dynamic is when it comes to air versus air battles, where both armies are able to subvert that terrain,
Yeah.
and you often just have like these two armies like running into each other, and there's relatively low opportunity for positioning relative to the other kinds of battles, and relatively low amount of the ways to differentiate yourself for even an experienced player. So at Stormgate, we want to we want to encourage more ground versus ground battles. We want to encourage more ground versus air battles,
Yeah.
and kind of limit the power of air units overall. Perhaps make them more specialized so that they can't just run over entire ground armies.
Cool. That's it's really funny because I think it was the Mutalisks got buffed in Heart of the Swarm, and we had the Mutaverse Muta ZVZ meta, which led to at one point in time Spore Crawlers doing 45 damage a shot to Mutalisks, which was the only way that it could be disincentivized because everyone was like, "Man, we do not like watching Mutify. It's like it's the two Muta blobs are growing and neither one wants to engage, and then like." And you just like it was the aesthetically
Yeah.
unpleasing, not very satisfying to play. And we're watching it, and it's one of those. Whenever there's an air versus air fight, and same with Phoenix versus Phoenix, as a caster, I just open the units tab, man, and I just read the. I'm like, because I can't tell what's going on, and I've been playing the game my whole life, and I'm just like, oh, that one's got a few more of the air unit now. They're gonna crush this fight, like because you just need to look at the units tab to really see what's going on, because everything's on top of each other, and it's just a bit of a mess. So, yeah, I think it's definitely really cool to have those different advantages, and it's so funny because I'm so indoctrinated into the way the current form of StarCraft 2 is, but I do think about how much people still complain about, the medevacs boosting into the main, or the warp prism with the 12 zealot warp in. Suddenly that's 24 supply just got built inside your main base. And it is this funny thing, right, where you'll even see in modern StarCraft, a lot more people will send 4 empty medevacs to the main, and the Protoss moves half of his army to respond, and the whole army hits the third base. And I'm like, oh my god, just the threat of that is so traumatizing that it's a legitimate strategy now, that is used in world championship matches and that sort of stuff, where people are threatening it. The old hallucinated warp prism is a classic. Hey, I'm sending, it's totally a real warp prism, and I could warp 30 supply in your main, and a big pack of units goes up there to respond and defend, and there's actually nothing in it. So it's kind of cool to try and make it a little bit more about the map control. Now, something where we talk about SC2, Terran versus Zerg is everyone's favorite matchup. Not everybody's, let's say 80% of the viewer base. And it's because there is an inbuilt map control element where creep spread is incredibly powerful, and it kind of forces that element where the Terran has the job of, I've got to get out there and slow the creep spread down. But it also does give it sort of insane defender's advantage to the Zerg on that creep. It does create an almost like a line in the sand where the Zerg wants to fight if the Terran comes across that line, and the Terran just wants to keep pushing that line back. But it does create some fascinating map control, and the most exciting games, I think, in any RTS is where there's that movement around the map and the positioning. For me, it's always about the interactive wrestling nature of the game. I think it's totally fine for some times one race is turtled up for a little bit. You're in your corner going through a weak period while you're building up, right? And it can kind of swap who naturally has map control. Terran's turtled up against Protoss, and then Stim and Shields and Medevacs are out, and then they've got the map control, and the Protoss is turtled up until their splash damage kicks in a little bit. That can be good. Other than the terrain, are there any other design features you guys are thinking about in terms of just encouraging the players to fight over the map, or maybe like, oh, you can capture power-ups on the map or creeps or anything like that, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, I think one thing you mentioned about Terran versus Zerg, I think the reason that matchup, or part of the reason that matchup is so dynamic, is that in that matchup there is kind of an innate mini map objectives over the map, which are the creep tumors, right? In order to gain an advantage, you don't necessarily have to deal game-ending damage via killing an army or killing a bunch of workers, but you can kill these like. There's like often hundreds of these mini creep tumors that each one you kill is a marginal win. And this allows for a lot of dynamics, a lot of dynamicism within the matchup itself. Um, and it's also something that is in generally, if the game is even, it's focused towards the middle of the map, which encourages players to go out in the middle and engage each other. So those are kind of some of the lessons that we take from creep tumors or just mid-map objectives. One of the things that we're looking into in Stormgate is the idea of creeps, but specifically the idea of respawnable creeps. So creeps are an example of something that existed in Warcraft 3, right? But the problem with creeps, in my opinion, in Warcraft 3 is, or one of the problems is that after you've cleared the map of creeps, you basically have nothing else to do. As you're fighting over these creeps, there are many objectives. Players are encouraged to interact with each other while they're creeping. There's things called creep jacks, for instance. But after you clear the map, and this happens especially on Echo Isles, you kind of just turtle there because like you have nothing else to do. So the idea of respawnable creeps is that every time you kill these creeps, they eventually respawn, and it's another objective for you to kill, such that this corner of the map is still used, such that all corners of the map, the entire map, there's still incentives to go out onto the entire map to complete this objective. Funnily enough, this mechanics also somewhat existed in, or this type of mechanic has existed in StarCraft 2 as well. Not necessarily creeps, but a mid map objective. I don't know, Pig, if you remember the greatest StarCraft map of all time, Fruitland.
Yeah. Dude, I can't find the version of the map that has the pickups anymore, because I
Oh
always host
no.
this for fun events, and I can't. I'm always talking about the lemons that you could pick up for like minerals, right? So what was it? You'd go out there and you'd attack it, and then you could pick up and carry, like, was it 200 minerals home or something?
Yeah, I don't exactly how much it was, but yeah, you did something with the big lemon and it dropped like these little. minerals, and yeah, that's a. I wish that had been explored a lot more, because I think that general kind of idea has a lot of potential. I think like one thing is that like MOBAs have are a new genre of game that has come up from Warcraft 3, right?
Yeah.
And I think when a lot of players are when a lot of like game designers kind of talk about, oh, we want to take elements from MOBAs in order to make it more approachable. And I think often those elements are, oh, we just make it very hero based with like super powerful heroes and leveling, and that's the lesson that they take. But I think one of the greatest lessons we can take from MOBAs is the objective based play,
Mm.
and the idea that especially in a team based game, you kind of direct players towards one objective and then the other objective and then another objective. And the idea of respawnable creeps is an idea directly from Dota or from like these MOBAs, that I think it still allows us to preserve what an RTS is, um, with and in addition take lessons from that game mode to help improve RTS.
That's interesting. So yeah, it's like this. It is so funny because yeah, that is what exactly what I think about. If you say, "Oh, we're just going to take a lot of inspiration from MOBAs," I'm like, "Oh, it's all about heroes and item leveling and being centralized." But you're kind of taking the objectives of the map, the creeps, these things that give you boosts. You take out a tower and you get some extra money for the team, but you could do that within still a sort of medium or large scale RTS battle. Speaking of which, I mean that's we want it to be less lethal than StarCraft, more lethal than Warcraft 3. Warcraft 3, for those who don't know, you can have a footman and a grunt, and it's an epic brawl for 6 years until either one dies. StarCraft 2, you have a Marine and a Zergling, and bam, bam, someone's going down in the first few seconds of that fight. I've heard we want it somewhere in between. Which direction do we know? Are you still testing? Too early to tell. Is it more on the Warcraft end, more on the StarCraft 2 end?
Yeah, so we're definitely still testing right now, and specifically where we want to end up is somewhere between StarCraft 1 and Warcraft 3. If I had to kind of plot these on a spectrum, I would say it goes StarCraft 2 and then pretty close to StarCraft 1, and then all the way over here is Warcraft 3. And we want to be somewhere in between StarCraft 1 and Warcraft 3. We
Hmm.
want to go in a less lethal approach, for a couple of reasons. Number one, you kind of alluded to this, the idea that if you have like a group of Marines, let's say 5 Marines, and you're not paying attention and you lose them in the beginning of the game, it can be very punishing. You can just lose the game. If you have these battles be slightly less lethal, what can end up happening is you still take, let's say, half of your HP, and then you're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh man, like my units are taking damage. Let me pull these guys back, and you've lost a ton of value to your army, but you don't necessarily instantly lose the game.
Yeah.
The second consideration is specific to team games, because social play and because team games are really are a focus of Stormgate as well. We Let me describe what ends up happening in StarCraft 2. I find that in a lot of StarCraft 2 team games, because of the high volatility
Yeah.
of the units, what ends up happening a lot, let's say in a 2v2 game, is you have these two armies and these two armies, and the first two armies on each respective team run into each other, and then they kill each other off, and then the back two armies kill each other and fight each other, and then they somehow the battle resolves, and it feels like less of a team game and more like two individual 1v1s. We like the idea. We like how Warcraft 3 team games work a little better in that respect, in that you often actually have all the teammates or all the members of the team engaging in the battle at the same time and interacting with each other at the same
Mm.
time. And lower lethality lets us achieve that. And then finally, from the PvE co-op perspective, StarCraft 2's co-op mode was always balanced around the idea of StarCraft being the basis of what the mode is. But one problem with this, well, there's two problems. Number one, the game was so balanced around breakpoints and high lethality. It was really balanced around the idea of I can kill you instantly, and that comes both in the form of nukes that instantly nuke your like Amon's army, and also in the balance of the game with respect to high DPS units. Raynor, for example, uses a ton of Marines, and his goal is to just DPS the enemy down before they can shoot the Marines, or they'd be too vulnerable.
Yeah.
This this prevents us from naturally scaling enemies via things like HP and damage, like what happens in a lot of other genres, like ARPGs or just RPGs in general. Because once you get past these breakpoints, your units suddenly become. Let's say you buff your opponent's HP by like 10%, right? That doesn't mean your units are worse by 10%. If you somehow hit a breakpoint there, or you magically hit a breakpoint that you're not aware of, your units can maybe be 50% less effective, even though you only buff the enemy HP by 10%.
Yeah.
Another thing that high lethality does in co-op is that it really prevents us from adding buffs and debuffs into the game in a meaningful way. Because the philosophy is basically, why would I ever debuff an enemy when I can just kill them? Everything in this game kills stuff very well. So debuffs are kind of like a class of ability that we really wanted to put into StarCraft 2 co-op that exists in a lot of other cool almost every other game, like again RPGs or card games or just everything you can think of, but we can never fit it into StarCraft co-op because of the high lethality of StarCraft. So for a lot of reasons, from a lot of game modes, I think the lower lethality could be very beneficial.
And just to rehash that, so for anyone who skimmed through, because I know people, do sometimes skim through this. So that was somewhere between the Brood War and the Warcraft 3, and a little bit more on the Brood War end of the spectrum of the lethality, was it?
We haven't really decided yet. It's
Yeah,
definitely somewhere in the close to the middle. I would say is the
somewhere
most
in the
accurate
middle.
answer.
Okay, cool. It's really interesting because, like, I'm so interested in that because people have asked me, do you want Stormgate to be more like Warcraft, more like SC2? And I've always said, well, I want it to be something new more than anything. And I love StarCraft and I love it for what it is, but I really would love an RTS that takes us in a new direction. And as someone who never really was a high level Warcraft 3 player, I was always like, oh, it'd be cool to have slower battles and things with like a little bit more, you can taste the fight a little bit more and feel it out as you go. Especially, as we get older. What can I say? I've got to be able to play this game when I'm 50, monk. So maybe not as slow as Warcraft 3 battles, though. I do like the sound of that. Somewhere in the middle, as something which definitely we can feel a little bit less of the knee jerk. So from what I hear, you guys probably want to make sure you have disruptors, instant cooldown nukes that can one-shot armies when you're not looking, right? That seems like a good idea to fit with this philosophy.
I think our philosophy there is a couple of things. We want definitely lower volatility overall.
Yeah.
So with a disruptor shot, maybe our equivalent of a disruptor shot would number one, it would only maybe take half the HP, so you're still able to respond to it. And number two, with regards to very lethal attacks or abilities, we want it to be more of a we want the unit that is doing the ability to be put more in danger. So I think the best example here is the Baneling, for instance, right? The Baneling has the potential for a ton of damage, but it's always putting itself in danger when you're
Mm.
threatening to do the damage. Whereas a Disruptor, you can kind of just like shoot the ball and then back off, and because it has such a long range, it's often very difficult to punish the Disruptor. I think if the game were if the only consideration was for very high level gameplay, I think it's actually kind of cool that like Clem, for instance, like is really good at microing around and targeting disruptors. But I think that's an example of an ability that's relatively inaccessible for newer players,
Mm.
and it can feel very frustrating for these players as well.
I love that. It's funny because we even see pro players hit themselves with their own disruptor shots on the regular, as you've emptied your front line and then one comes in from behind and hits your own army. So yeah, it's interesting to see these high skill differentiations, but the thing is, you could see this in Warcraft 3 as well. If I'm watching Todd and Grubby go at it, there is an immense amount of things they're doing, and I'm fascinated to watch it, even if it does feel a little slow to my own tastes for playing at least in Warcraft 3. So, okay, so this sounds fascinating. Obviously, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've already gone for so long, and I appreciate you making yourself available for this. A couple of last points just to finish on. So the 3v3 mode's meant to be, dedicated socially competitive mode. I'm wondering, hey, what if it just kicks up super viral, super awesome? You guys somewhat open to it maybe becoming maybe either the dominant esport or at least a side by side featured esport kind of the Stormgate game mode if that ends up being just insanely popular?
Yeah, so I think our esports team. I think one of the core tenets of our esports team is that we're I'm not on the team, of course, but for what I hear, we're willing to be very flexible with how the game develops. Right now, the primary esports mode that we're going to support is the 1v1 mode, but we're still going to have things for the 3v3 mode, and we're really going to see how popular each of these game modes are and give the appropriate support for each mode. Personally, I think something that could be really cool is the idea of either the old pro leagues or the old WC3L in Warcraft 3, where you
Oh,
have like this like kind of clan war. But in the early days of WC3L, you had three 1v1s and you had two 2v2s in order to determine who won the clan war. So kind of like a mixed style competition where
sick.
maybe it's three 1v1s and then these 1v1 players have to play a 3v3 together. I think that could be really cool.
Dude, that would be great. I love that idea. We're like, which one will it be? Which one will you focus on? It's like, well, hey, would be cool to have both as well. As always, why not both? Often an option we sometimes overlook. Are they going to be different units in and win conditions? I know you guys are going to be a little more experimental in the 3v3 mode, right?
Yeah, totally. With regards to actual unit balance, we're going to do our absolute best to maintain the balance between the 1v1 and the 3v3 modes in order to for players to be able to more easily bounce back between the modes as easily. However, where we're going to differentiate is the mechanics of the game modes themselves. At Stormgate, at Frost Giant, we're actually building the 3v3 mode from the ground up. And what that means is we're rethinking all the game rules of our 3v3 mode. Traditionally in Blizzard RTS, the rules of a 3v3 game or any team game are completely copy and pasted from
Mm.
1v1. And you have these mechanics like you can't build on your allies creep, for example, right?
Oh my god,
Um,
yes.
so we're actually going to go like much more experimental there. We're going to make the rules of this game makes a lot of sense for a 3v3 team mode and change a lot of things up that wouldn't necessarily exist in 1v1. And that's how we're going to kind of tweak the balance in our 3v3 mode versus the 1v1 mode rather than the units themselves.
That's awesome. I people often team games just aren't balanced in SE2. Doesn't matter. But just a little bit of love has been so missing there for so long, the classic loads into team game, ally kills your allied
Yeah.
base, and then just like leaves the game, and you're like, what just happened? Like, is that guy gonna get banned? Nope, he's queuing again. Okay, so abusive play and cheaters and stuff like that. I imagine you guys are gonna try and manage those communities pretty active, keep that in control. I don't know if you guys talked about like a low priority queue or anything like that for the naughty players, so they get put in the naughty queue.
Yeah, that's something we've definitely talked about in a lot of our discussions about how to manage toxicity. We I can't promise anything there, but some
Yeah.
of the things that we are thinking about are um, number one, we want to try to make the game less focused about winning or losing. I think one thing that StarCraft kind of falls, one thing that StarCraft players have the mentality of is that the only thing that matters is whether I win or whether I lose, right? And how we plan to mitigate this is number one, we're going to try to make the game be more about the improvements and the progress that you make along the way. It's less about the destination, more about the journey. And we're going to do that by adding things like quests, like achievements. Infamously, StarCraft multiplayer allowed you to level up to level 60, but we're going to try to have a more robust progression system in which every game that you play, and it's not just every win that you win, matters. We're also going to try to have more stats um, allow you to see how you improve. This is very similar to you have above average APM for what you had before in StarCraft, where you are supply blocked for a lower amount of time. We're also taking a lot of cues from Overwatch, in which there are things called there's MVP callouts and there's
Oh,
kudos in
sick.
team games, and these are both examples of things that I think helps make the gameplay a better experience for everyone because it encourages players to kind of prop each other up. Um, with respect to cheaters or hackers or that whole crowd, um, our engineering team is definitely working on that, and I actually talked to them yesterday about like what are the strategies around mitigating that. So first of all, I will say we are going to have cheaters, we are going to have hackers and Stormgate at launch. um,
Yeah.
there's going to be a ton of vulnerabilities just because it's a new game, and it's really inevitable. However, one cool thing that I can share, and this is a bit technical, but basically Snowplay is going to communicate with the Unreal Engine, and Unreal Engine is what allows us to render the units. And one cool thing about how these two things communicate is that you, as a player, will not have access to what is in the fog of war, other than the fact that there are units in the fog of war.
Right.
So hopefully that will help us mitigate map hacks. Even though
Mm.
in this format, theoretically, you still could have map hacking in that it's kind of like a sensor. It's going to be more like a sensor tower map
There's red
hacking.
dots coming towards us. There's an income. It's like radar. You could have radar hacks.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think I don't understand how this works at all, but I think that's really cool.
That's awesome. Okay, so obviously very realistic there. I kind of just for the memes, I want there to be a game coming out and there to be like a kind of Dana White with the UFC moment where he's like, "We found the guy. We found the guy that was restreaming it, and we shut him down." I'm like, yeah, it was one guy. Sure, that's it. I'm sure that's gonna work. Nothing else will spring up. There no illegal hacks or cheats or anything like this. And it's like. I think obviously there's going to be an ongoing process there, but I like that you guys are dedicated already to thinking about that and dealing with it. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Before I do let you leave, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we go? Any areas that you think are important to cover, or anything else you'd like to say? And same for Twitch chat. If you guys think there's anything very important that I've ignored here, now's your chance to shout it in chat. I'm pretty sure there's nothing important, but we'll see if there's something that jogs my memory. But what about you, Monk? Anything else you'd like to share?
Well, is it time for me to go into salesman mode here, Pig?
Oh, I mean, do you need to go into salesman mode? Normally, we just need to hear your lovely voice and passion. But show me what you can do. Give me your sales pitch.
All right, let's do this. So, you know what you can do to help support Stormgate? Number one, you can go to playstormgate.com, where you can sign up for both the beta and the public newsletter, in which you will receive developmental updates every few months. Number two, you can wishlist Stormgate on Steam. This will help us prop us up on the Steam algorithm, which will expose Stormgate to even more players. And number three, Pig, you know what you can do? You can tell all your friends, all your buddies that you're streaming to on Twitch, and all their friends and all friends of those friends, that they can also do the same to spread the love of RTS and to spread the love of Stormgate.
Heck diddly, yeah. I literally just wishlisted it while we were talking. Actually, I was like, you know what? I haven't wishlisted Stormgate. So while you were answering one of the questions about 10 minutes ago, I opened up Steam and wishlisted it. There's links down in the chat if you're watching live. If you're on YouTube, check the description below. And please do share it with your friends and get everyone excited about Stormgate, guys, because for me, this is very exciting. I talked a little bit with Tim about how, for me, it feels like finally we've got the crack esports team of RTS veterans together who've learned so much from the successes, but also the failures of some of the biggest past titles, and especially Blizzard titles and RTS. And it's well funded as well, which unfortunately a lot of RTS games in the last 10 to 20 years have not been. So, and hopefully it'll get even more well funded as time goes. So, as much as right now, I am absolutely sucking at the teat of Frost Giant, to give a very weird analogy there. I'm very excited. I'm going, I'm on the train. I'm on the hype train. It's for good reason. It's because I see the passion that you guys are going. And right now, though, there isn't gameplay to show. And that is something which some people are saying, I need to see the gameplay. We need to wait for that. The beta is, of course, planning to come out next year, 2023. And I'm sure now that we've got, you guys have talked about the pillars, the design philosophies, the resources, the factions. we're going to start to hear about that more and more, I'm sure, over the coming year as things get fleshed out and they're ready to showcase and as that beta gets closer and closer. So it's a very exciting time for all of us. As always, it's great to hear you guys be very honest and realistic. I think as much as I'm on the hype train, I hope that the people who've watched this interview are realizing part of the reason is because guys like Monk here and Tim are so realistic in their non-overselling anything. It's like, oh, we're trying to do this. You know, you guys are not saying everything's going to be perfect, but you're absolutely working in the right direction. So I just want to say a big thanks to your for the passion, the hard work, and for once again, since I've been live during the subathon, coming and talking about the exact same points you've spent the last 2 weeks talking about 24/7 and still being as passionate and insightful. So thanks so much for the explanations, mate.
Of course, it's a lot of coffee, and Pig, thank you for having me, and really good luck to your subathon. How many hours have you been on for?
Oh my lord, too many, mate. Let's I guess I can take a little look see really quickly. I think we're at about 230 now, 220 maybe, something like that. About 220 or so. Too many, mate.
Yeah, well then, here's a glass to you and our respective media kicks.
Cheers, mate.
Oh, cheers.
All right, well, thank you very much to Monk. Thanks everyone for watching, and don't forget to check out the rest of the stuff. You can follow, of course, the progress not just on PlayStormgate.com, but also go check out their YouTube channel, Frost Giant Studios, where they are posting developer updates and the like, as well as over on Twitter. Links are all below, everybody. Thanks for watching. And if I do get some more interviews, stay posted. We may get a chance to talk to more of the devs over the coming weeks and months. And especially whenever there's an announcement, I will be following that and posting up my own reactions and analyses and insights on that stuff. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time. Goodbye and good night.